You're watching the Creator Channel. Please like the video and subscribe.
The first year of High King Torrhen did not begin in silence. It began with motion. In one same royal week, the realm was ordered to celebrate in 4 places at once: races and contests at Prince's Pass, great lists and melee at Harrenhal, civic games and food distributions at Crown Hill, and courtly riding, archery and evening feasts at Summerhall. Men understood the design immediately. The new king was not hiding inside Palace Hill, while the memory of Gerald still hung over the realm. He was showing himself in the roads, in the gate passes, in the old war seats, and in the pleasure courts, letting every region feel the new reign as presence rather than parchment. The old king had expanded outward. Torrhen meant to bind inward and outward at the same time. At Prince's Pass, the games took on the shape of a frontier fair and a royal audit all at once. Dornish horsemen raced the lower roads while caravan lords, toll clerks, eastern factors, and armor merchants crowded the galleries above the arena that Gerald had enlarged in his later years. Treasure from Essos, dyed cloth, carved ivory, worked bronze, aromatic oils, and ledgers heavier than some swords, changed hands while heralds read the names of winners and tax privileges beneath hanging maroon and gold banners. Torrhen sat high in the steward's box with Lord Corwin Darry, now the king's hand, and Elmar of Wintertown a half-step behind his chair, never loud, never idle, always there in the line of sight of anyone trying to study the new king too closely. To the lower crowd it looked festive. To the men who counted grain and power, it looked like a statement that Dorne, customs, eastern traffic, and royal law were now parts of the same machine. At Harrenhal, the tone was different. There the tournaments had weight in them. Armoured riding through the blackened giant yards, shield walls in display, blunted cavalry charges, foot melees before noble stands, and oaths taken beneath royal standards in the old fortress that now wore the face of Crown Hill service. The garrison no longer looked like a patchwork loan of rivermen and scorched castle remnant. Torrhen's reforms had reached it fully. The men on guard stood in the same maroon burgundy cloth and gold-trimmed order as the capital troops, each bearing the new tall crown shield, severe, uniform, and unmistakably royal, though behind them the smaller banners of river houses still hung for memory and representation. That visual change mattered as much as any decree. A lord arriving at Harrenhal no longer saw an allied force. He saw the state. Back at Crown Hill the games were grander and more dangerous in another way, not militarily but politically. The city had grown richer off Gerald's eastern turn, and wealth had sharpened its appetite. So Torrhen gave the capital both spectacle and procedure. Chariot races along the lower avenues, staged combat in the public yards, formal hearings on market disputes, and great processions of the guilds through the street courts of Crown Hill gave the small folk their share of the new reign, while the Senate watched from stone galleries and private boxes. On the steps above the Senate Hall, Torrhen leaned heavily on a newly created position known as the Voice of the Senate, a trained reader whose duty was to stand before the steps and read letters, decrees, news, petitions accepted for hearing, tax remissions, military appointments, and eastern dispatches aloud, so the city heard the state in one disciplined voice rather than in tavern fragments. This was one of Torrhen's quiet strengths. He understood that a government becomes larger the moment its language becomes orderly in public. The Senate met constantly in those months, and Torrhen made a point of letting it remain central. He did not build a hidden inner circle to rival it. He did the opposite. Men who had once belonged to the tighter royal lane found themselves called into the same chambers as senators, provincial envoys, and fiscal officers, until it became obvious to everyone that the old separate habit had dissolved for the moment into one larger governing stage. This created noise, pride, and delay, but it also let the realm see who truly mattered. Lord Corwin Darry handled the floor better than anyone expected, guiding disputes, calming injured vanity, and making certain that the richest men in the chamber could not mistake loudness for command. Apollo of Norvos appeared often as well, not as a speechmaker, but as the man with plans, drains, vaults, bridge measurements, and cost tallies in hand, the kind of figure senators mocked until his numbers made their districts richer or safer. Torren let them all speak, then cut through the tangle with a shorter sentence than the room had prepared for. He travelled more than many expected for a man marked by a builder's reputation. That, too, was deliberate. He would not allow the realm to say that Geralt won distance and Torren shrank from it. So within his first year he moved between Crown Hill, Harrenhal, the northern harbours, the lower river seats, the Dornish lanes, and the old garrison roads, taking petitions in person, inspecting walls, reviewing granaries, sitting in local courts, and appearing often enough that no region could claim neglect as an excuse for insolence. Where Geralt had ridden as a conquering high king, Torren rode more often as an inspecting sovereign, studying wells, roads, baths, troop quarters, markets, and customs posts with the same seriousness other men reserved for battle lines. The people noticed. They began repeating a simple difference between the two reigns. Gerald made the realm larger. Torren was making it hold. The northern question rose early. Reports from the frontier had thickened, not of one invasion all at once, but of harder organization beyond the old line, deeper ranging parties, stockpiling in hidden valleys, more movement tied to the farther houses and powers beyond the settled north. The names varied by report, house then, Borog's sphere, the kingdom of the first men, smaller frost-bound chiefs, and distant factions looking south with more purpose than before. Torren did not answer first with a grand army. He answered with surveyors, engineers, bridgemen, quartermasters, cold-weather smiths, and mounted escorts, the beginning of a true northern occupation policy instead of a southern lord's temporary show of force. If the far north meant to expand, then the realm would answer with stone, timber, food, signal towers, and permanent men. That was how the first line of what later generations would compare to a wall began. Not a single impossible monument at once, but a chain of fortified passages, linked yards, winter posts, and hardened supply courts pushing the authority of the High King farther toward the lands of always winter. This did not make Torren beloved in every quarter. Many senators preferred games to timber accounts and race days to frost expenditure. Others feared the northern build-out would enrich the harbour and worksmen around the king more than the old-speaking families. There were also men who had liked Geralt's vanishing almost too much and had hoped the new reign would prove weaker, softer, or easier to steer. Instead, they found Torren with a growing royal guard, a broader senate, a king's hand who could hold a room, an engineer whose projects kept turning into visible improvements, and an image of order that was beginning to impress even those who resented it. Around him stood a sharer of Winterfell, never overexposed, never absent, and Elmar of Wintertown, whose closeness to the king's private path began earning the first quiet looks, and later would earn much louder ones. For now, though, those things stayed beneath the surface. The reign was still young enough that the visible work mattered more than the private speculation. So Torren's first year took its shape in full view of the realm. Games in 4 seats, Senate government at the center, road travel without pause, a speaking state on the Senate steps, a more unified army face from Crown Hill to Harrenhal, and a colder, more permanent answer to the north than any southern court had tried before. He was not ruling like Geralt, and that was exactly why the realm accepted him. A second Geralt would have looked false. Torren instead looked like what came after expansion, the man who had inherited a wide dominion and meant to turn it into something that could last through winter, argument, and distance alike. High King Torren did what many men expected him not to do. He did not take ship first. He did not vanish behind harbour curtains and arrive in the north by the easy water lane. He chose the long road instead, and made a show of it in the old royal way, a moving court, small enough to travel fast, large enough to look like rule. 50 Crownland guards rode with him in the with scribes, stewards, physicians, survey men, and stable hands stretched between them in a narrow living column. At his side rode Lord Corwin Darry, the king's hand, patient-eyed and steady in the saddle, with Elmar of Wintertown never far behind, and Apollo of Norvos grimly counting bridges, ditches, stones, and wasted labour every mile they passed. Torrin meant the realm to see him on the King's Road, the great north-south road of the kingdoms, crossing the causeway through the neck, passing Moat Cailin, and riding on toward Winterfell, rather than skipping the hardship and arriving softened by sea. The road itself invited that sort of progress, running north through the riverlands, becoming a causeway through the neck, with Moat Cailin guarding the northern edge before the way continues through the Barrowlands and southeastern Wolfswood toward Winterfell. The journey changed tone once the column reached the marshes. Southron stone and field order gave way to damp air, bogwater smell, reeds, and long grey stretches where sound carried oddly, and men began looking sideways without always knowing why. Torrin liked that part of the trip more than most of his following did. It reminded the entire train that the north was not merely a colder extension of Crown Hill, but a country defended by ground as much as by banners. At Moat Cailin, the old truth stood up out of the bog. It's still the kind of place that made decrees from the south feel smaller than they had looked when first written. The old histories fit the place well, the neck as bulwark, the moat as gate, the north as a realm that had kept more of its own shape than the rest of Westeros ever had. That was where Torrin began understanding more clearly what some of his clerks had only guessed at. The first High King's order, stripping down the old kingly styles, may have held in the south and river country more firmly than in the far north. Here the older language had not died. It had endured in hall speech, in clan memory, in barrow claims, in the way men still measured Winterfell against all lesser seats. Torrin did not challenge that on the causeway, and he did not challenge it at the moat. He rode through it and watched it instead. If the North had never fully yielded its old kingly grammar, there was no profit in forcing that quarrel on the road before he had even taken supper with its greatest powers. The question would return later. He knew that already. For the moment, he preferred to meet northern dignity in full form, rather than insult it with southern technicalities. From the moat, the column bent northeast and then eastward toward White Harbour, and the change was immediate once they reached the White Knife country. The roads improved, traffic thickened, patrols appeared in better order, and the smell of salt began slipping into the air well before the city itself came into view. White Harbour stood where it always had, southeast of Winterfell at the mouth of the White Knife, the North's true trade port and the largest settlement north of the Neck, a city cleaner, wider, and more south-facing in its field than most northern seats. Its whitewashed stone, dark slate roofs, harbour walls, and divided inner and outer anchorage gave it a face unlike the rest of the north, while the new castle above and the old Wolf's Den below still told the older story of Stark rule at the mouth of the river. Torrin stayed only one night in White Harbour, but that one night mattered. It was the first time the realm had seen him return there in full royal form since the crown had passed to him, and the city answered with a mixture of affection, scrutiny, calculation, and pride. Harbour bells rang. The quay torchlines were doubled. Alehouses emptied into the streets. The fish market still stank the good salt stink of a working port, while the better lanes were washed, lit, and kept in order for the king's approach. Torrin took supper in the new castle, not as a guest trying to charm old household loyalties, but as a king revisiting a place that had helped make him. There was family there, old retainers, men who remembered him before the higher title, women who measured the weight he had lost and the confidence he had gained, boys trying too hard not to stare at the Crown Guard, and older harbour captains who cared less for ceremony than for whether the Northern Fleet appropriations would continue under the new reign. He gave them reassurance in the practical style they trusted most: more dockwork, more ship timber, stronger seal rock batteries, better customs ledgers, and a closer river and road connection with the inland courts. The next morning he rode inland to Winterfell, and there the northern part of the progress truly began. He did not enter the castle as though he were coming to absorb it. He entered as a high king willing to meet another ancient centre with the respect due to it. Waiting for him were two figures who showed at once how different the north still was from the south. The Stark ruler of Winterfell, still receiving old honours from many of his own people, and the Barrow King out of the Barrowlands, who came with the grave old dignity of those houses that remembered their crowns long after other realms had filed theirs down into lordship. Torrhen met both in the great hall before the heat of the day had fully risen through the stones, with no hidden chamber and no private whispering arrangement to lessen the weight of the meeting. This was northern politics the way the North liked it, direct, visible, and wrapped in old memory. They spoke first of rank, though not in the foolish sense. The Stark made clear that the North had not forgotten the old decrees, yet neither had it ever entirely changed the names by which it understood itself. Torrhen answered with the same patience that had already become the strength of his reign. He did not demand the burial of every old style. He demanded order, road access, levy response, and clear frontier authority. Let the North keep memory in its whole language. Let the North call certain men kings where old customs still clung to them. The High King cared more that northern strength answer the larger realm when the frontier shifted. That answer satisfied the room more than a harder one would have done. Not fully, not forever, but enough for business to begin. And business in that season meant the far north. Reports from the outer houses, frontier riders, traders, and watchposts all pointed the same way: harder gathering beyond the familiar line, more movement tied to the kingdom of the first men, bolder ranging from the farther frostbound peoples, and enough quiet organization among the remote northern houses to make even the older men in Winterfell stop dismissing it as only winter habit. Torrhen laid his plan before them plainly: fortified staging grounds, longer supply chains, permanent occupation yards, timber ramparts in the first phase, then stone where stone could be hauled and held, with signal towers, winter roads, and fortified courts pushing farther toward the harsher edge. Apollo of Norvos unrolled the drawings, while Lord Corwin Darry translated works language into rule language, showing where costs would fall, where labour would come from, and how a line of support could become a line of dominion if it were held long enough. The Northern Authority did not love every part of it. They respected that it was real. What followed was not an alliance feast dressed as policy. It was a northern bargain. The northern ruler would support the first extension of fortified occupation toward the lands beyond the settled line, so long as Winterfell's authority in the Old North was not reduced to southern bookkeeping. The Barrow King would contribute men and carters from the Barrowlands for timber and ditch work, on the understanding that the old Barrow claims and burial protections would be left untouched by road expansion. Torrhen accepted both terms with only small alterations. He was wise enough to know that the first frontier wall, if wall it became, would not be built by decree alone. It would be built by families, rival memories, grudges, wagon trains, marsh cutters, northern axes, and royal coin meeting each other in weather. None of the senators at Crown Hill would ever willingly stand inside. By the time Torrhen left Winterfell, the realm had learned something useful about him. He could travel in royal form. He could sit in White Harbour and look native. He could pass Moat Cailin and not flinch. He could meet northern title holders without stripping the dignity from the room, and he could still return from that same room with more authority than he had entered with. That was not Gerald's gift. It was his own. Gerald had expanded the world. Torrhen had begun proving he could thread the older worlds together, without letting any one of them believe it had beaten the rest. So the first major northern progress ended with no single great battle, and no empty spectacle of obedience. It ended with a road proven, a harbour revisited, Winterfell measured, the old king language of the north left alive but bounded, and the first true royal shape of a northern occupation policy taking form under the eye of the High King. The next step now sat waiting in timber, frost, and argument. The first frontier works beyond the settled line, and the question of whether Torren meant merely to secure the north, or begin turning the far lands into part of the realm in a way no southern sovereign had yet managed. When High King Torren returned from the north, he did not come back to a resting court. He came back to a capital already moving under decisions made in his name. Petitions stacked high, northern reports arriving in batches, and every lord who had watched his progress now trying to guess what the next order would be. Court representatives, left in Crown Hill as they had done exactly what Torren needed. The city was steady, the palace offices were working, the Senate was meeting without drifting into paralysis, and no man had mistaken the king's absence for weakness. That mattered more than praise. Torren entered Palace Hill through the upper court just after dusk, took the greetings he had to take, and went directly into a working chamber where Corwin had already laid out the northern reports by road, fort line, and supply burden, rather than by the vanity of whichever lord had written loudest. Apollo of Norvos was there as well, with fresh plans weighted under stone, and Ashara of Winterfell stood near the firelight with the sort of stillness that made the room quieter rather than softer. The first major session after his return was held before the full Senate, and this time the room understood that the northern progress had not been a pageant. It had been an inspection, and the king had come back with work in hand. The voice of the Senate read the opening decrees aloud from the steps before the hall. First, the Restoration Order confirming Moat Cailin as a functioning royal stronghold. Then, the sequence of new northern appropriations, timber rights, quarry levies, wagon contracts, and winter stores assigned to the frontier line. When the chamber took its seats, Torren let the argument begin where he knew it would: cost, labor, and whether the realm was securing the north or preparing to digest it. Senator Giles Hightower of Oldtown spoke first for structure and asked how long the Treasury was expected to underwrite Cold Country works before the northern houses themselves carried more of the burden. Senator Roland Grafton of Gulltown asked what protections would be given to the eastern sea lanes if more resources were driven inland and north. Then Senator Bennett of White Harbor rose and reminded the room that a frontier ignored in spring always returns in winter with a larger voice. Torren answered the way his reign was beginning to make familiar, not with theatre, but with sequence. The first northern phase would not be a great wall carved out of legend all at once. It would be a chain of secured yards, store courts, signal points, and linked timber and stone holds running outward from the safer line, beginning under royal oversight and then handed into a mixed pattern of northern and crown authority, once each position could sustain itself. Corwin Darry followed him with the second half of the design, the legal frame, road obligations, levy exemptions for houses providing labor instead of coin, and the guarantee that the first burden would not fall only on the north while the south merely applauded from drier seats. That split the tension in the room more cleanly than a single speech could have done. Torren set the policy. Corwin made it workable. Apollo, when called, stood only long enough to explain what the line required in practical terms: bath and wash houses at the larger garrisons, heated chambers for sick men and scribes, sealed grain floors, drainage trenches and wagon ramps that would still function after the first deep freeze. No one laughed at baths now. The last few years had taught too many men what happens to armies that try to winter like camp followers instead of states. After that session, the story moved faster. Survey teams were sent north from Moat Cailin under noble authority rather than left to clerks alone. Timber levies were apportioned through the Barrowlands and the White Knife Belt. Crown masons and northern carpenters were paired instead of divided, which irritated both groups at first and improved the work almost immediately. Torren remained in Crown Hill while this happened, which was its own kind of statement. He was not riding out every week to prove his courage to men who already knew he had it. He was ruling from the center, while forcing the center to carry the frontier with him. That also let him keep his eyes on the capital, where old disputes had not vanished merely because the northern line now had a timetable. The Reach wanted southern contractors favored in the stone orders. White Harbor wanted first refusal on shipping tied to northern supplies. Duskendale wanted road privileges widened where Crown cargo crossed its lanes. Torrhen heard them all, and granted less than each had hoped, enough to keep them moving, never enough to let one faction start calling royal necessity by its own family name. These months also settled the look of his rule in a way no single battle could have done. Palace Hill expanded upward and inward at the same time. New workrooms, stronger archive vaults, improved baths, guard passages, and audience spaces that made the complex look less like a survivor's palace and more like the seat of a ruler planning for generations rather than seasons. Apollo's hand was visible in all of it, the logic of flow, water, heat, and endurance, while Torrhen's was visible in the discipline of purpose, nothing added only to glitter, everything expected to work. Elmar of Wintertown had become a fixed presence near the king's private hours, and Ashara of Winterfell remained close enough that no court watcher failed to notice, yet the public life of the reign did not narrow into gossip. It widened into administration, travel plans, formal decrees, and the slow realization that Gerald had conquered in Arx and Torrhen was now binding those Arx into a state. Even the capital was beginning to speak of the old king and the new one differently. Gerald had made the realm larger. Torrhen was teaching it how to live inside its own size. By the close of that season, the next direction was visible. The northern works had begun and would now speak for themselves through timber, stone, wages, and the first permanent garrisons pushed outward from safety. Crown Hill was orderly enough for Torrhen to leave again when he chose, but not yet so settled that he could ignore it. And in the east, letters from King Aline Storm and the eastern marches were arriving often enough to remind the court that the wider provinces had not grown quieter while the High King rode north. So, what's next for the High King? Torrhen has fixed the center long enough to move again, and the question now is whether he goes first to inspect the northern line in its first true building phase, or turns back toward the east to show that Gerald's far conquests still live under the new crown. High King Torrhen did not announce Vesper keys to the realm as some great public enterprise. He handled it the way intelligent rulers handle the most useful places they ever build, by speaking of it lightly in open company and treating it seriously in private. The island on Tarth had long sat under crown reach in a half-forgotten way, watched, visited now and then, but never fully shaped into anything worthy of the sea road around it. Torrhen saw the value at once. It was distant enough from Crown Hill to feel removed, close enough to remain reachable, and handsome enough in its cliffs, coves, and sheltered water to host men who preferred their negotiations wrapped in salt air and privacy, rather than heard through stone corridors in the capital. So he left Lord Corwin Darry in Crown Hill to hold the center, took a smaller royal party east and south, and reached the island not with banners flung wide for spectacle, but with surveyors, scribes, shipwrights, and men who knew how to choose ground that could hold secrets without looking like it had been built for them. The first inspection began at dusk, and lasted half the night. Torrhen stood with Apollo of Norvos over a wide island map laid across a cedar table in a temporary harbour house, while lanterns burned low against the sea wind, and the black water moved beyond the open arches. With them were a handful of trusted men. Elmar of Wintertown posted where he could see both the room and the dark path to the quay, 2 royal surveyors, 1 old pilot from Tarth, and the young Riverlord who had only recently begun drawing the king's longer notice, Lord Alistair Mallister of Seagard, 23, fair-featured, steady, and already more patient than most men, twice his age. Torrhen did not speak to him, as one speaks to a decorative youth. He asked where the first dock should go, if the island one day needed to receive men in bad weather without attracting a crowd in open daylight. Alistair answered by pointing not to the prettiest bay, but to the one that could be screened from most passing sails, while still giving a clean landing in rough water, and Apollo's face changed just enough for Torrin to mark that the answer had landed well. That was how the island truly began, not with a feast or a decree, but with the first conversation in which useful men started showing they understood what the place was for. In the following days, the whole shape of Vesper Quays began to emerge. Apollo marked out a central road spine first, then the secondary lanes, then the water system, cisterns above, runoff below, bath channels where the grade allowed them, and service routes that would let workers, guards, and private guests move without crossing one another in stupid ways. Torrin approved the dock quarter, the first pair of waterside villas, a pool court for high company, and a temple lane that would give the island dignity without burdening it with solemnity it could not wear honestly. He also ordered monuments, not statues to flatter current men, but planned spaces for future commemorations, naval victories, founding decrees, alliances, and the sort of carved memory that makes a place feel older and more legitimate than it truly is. There would be no crude overbuilding. The island's strength would lie in selection, each structure placed with purpose, roads cut where they improved access, gardens where they softened the stone, and lookout points built as if for beauty while serving equally well as eyes over sea and approach. The first completed building was small, almost modest, and that was deliberate. It stood above a rocky rise facing the water, banded in pale stone and deep blue, looking more like a private retreat than the seed of an influence island. Inside, though, it already carried the future in miniature: private rooms, a warm bathing chamber, a secure writing room, side storage for sealed ledgers, and a covered entry that let important visitors come and go in weather without looking handled. Torrin walked through it with Apollo and Alistair one afternoon, while masons still cleaned dust from the threshold, and carpenters were fastening the final shutters. Apollo spoke about heat retention and salt wear. Alistair, more interested in human flow, pointed out how one chamber looked toward the water, while another looked back toward the inner roads, which meant a clever host could always choose whether a guest felt invited, observed, or isolated. Torrin said nothing for a few moments after that, then told them both the island would need not only stone and water, but memory: who came, who asked, who paid, who refused, who hesitated, who waited too long. That was the first moment when the young lord understood that Vesper Quays would not merely be a resort of the crown. It would be a machine for managing access. What later men would call the Black Book began without title and without ceremony. At first it was only a ledger kept in a narrow writing chamber near the watercourt, a careful record of names, ship captains, households owing favor, men worth receiving twice, women whose family connections opened one region and closed another, not for scandal, but for leverage, order, and future usefulness. Torrin did not write most of it himself. He had hands for that, but he reviewed its pages early, corrected its categories, and pushed it away from mere gossip into something sharper: a living map of influence, hosted dinners, private debts, future invitations, and controlled access. Lord Alistair Mallister proved unexpectedly suited to that work. He listened more than he spoke, remembered more than he showed, and possessed the kind of mild expression that makes louder men underestimate him until it is too late. Around Torrin, a few already wondering why the king was giving the young riverlord so much room near matters that would plainly grow larger than leisure. Torrin let them wonder. A ruler who intends to shape the next age benefits from being misread by men still staring at the current one. The island did not become idle or decadent in those early months. It was busy almost to severity. Shipwrights measured a secondary landing. Quarry crews opened a deeper cut farther inland. Gardeners brought in hardier growth first, then softer ornament after the windbreaks were proven. A bath complex was designed not as a single grand room, but as a layered sequence: hotter chambers inside, cooler courts outside, quiet pools for private company, larger basins for hosted gatherings, and service passages hidden well enough that a guest could believe the place ran on grace alone. Torrin liked that sort of deception. Not a falsehood, but a refinement. The same was true of the Temple Lane, which would not be a heavy sacred precinct meant to dominate the island, but a controlled processional space with shrines, torch basins, carved sea symbols, and enough solemnity to give the whole place moral gravity when needed. Men who came to ask for favor always behave differently if they have passed through stone that suggests history, gods, and consequence before they reach the room where the actual bargain waits. At night, Vesper Keys began to show the life it would one day be famous for, though still in restrained form. A few villas held invited company. Lanterns moved between pool courts and cliff paths. Music sounded once or twice, and stopped before it turned into noise. Torrin walked those courts with small groups, rarely more than 3 or 4, speaking of roads, harbours, monuments, patronage, and future hosting patterns rather than indulging the island too quickly. Around him moved a small cast of trusted attendants and guests from different corners of the realm, some there openly, some there by invitation too discreet to be written in ordinary harbour books. Lord Alistair learned fast in that atmosphere. He saw how a ruler could make men feel chosen without ever letting them forget they were being measured. He saw how private hospitality, if disciplined properly, could become more useful than public office. And he saw that Torrin's closeness to him would one day invite the usual court foolishness, while the real truth lay elsewhere, in trust, education, controlled access, and the quiet building of a network too useful to advertise before it was fully mature. By the time Torrin sailed back toward Crown Hill, the island no longer felt vacant. It felt started. The first roads were mapped, the dock sites chosen, the villas seeded, the bath system planned, the Temple Lane staked, the first ledger opened, and the first serious understanding formed between the High King, Apollo of Norvos, and the young man who would one day stand nearer to this place than most of the lords still laughing in the Senate. Vesper Keys was not yet the polished enclave later generations would whisper about. It was still stone dust, torchlight, salt wind, measured rooms, and ideas moving ahead of the buildings that would hold them. But that was enough. Great courts are rarely born all at once. More often they begin the way this one did, with a ruler who understands the value of distance, a builder who understands the value of form, and a young, ambitious mind learning that the most powerful doors in the world are the ones opened only for a chosen few. Before High King Torrin ever rode back to inspect the frontier line in person, the North had already begun arguing over what that line was meant to protect and what it was meant to control. The first great northern meeting of the new reign did not happen at Winterfell. It happened farther out, near Whitetree, where the safer roads gave way to harsher country, and every oath sounded more serious in the cold. The King of Winterfell rode there under old northern dignity with a hard escort, and a proper field army behind him, not to begin a war that day, but to make sure no man in the gathering mistook the North for a soft market waiting to be talked open. The host that followed him was large enough to be seen from the ridges before the council tents were even raised. Winterfell men, barrow levies, white knife riders, mountain clansmen sworn for the season, and wagon trains under guard all came in ordered columns, banners stiff in the wind, smith carts and grain wagons tucked well behind the spear line, horse pickets laid out like a moving town. The king had not marched north for spectacle. He had marched north to negotiate from strength, which in those lands was often the only language that reached the ear before blood did. Across from him stood a very different force, less polished to southern eyes, but larger in the way frontier powers often are when outsiders first bother to count them honestly. The kingdom of the First Men, under King Lando I of Hardhome, could now field strength in the range of 40,000 if its full valleys, coast camps, inland settlements, and sworn warbands were drawn together. That number did not include the other hard powers beyond the easy line, House Then, House Frost, the houses tied to the Northern Eye, and the lesser Frost Lords who shifted allegiance by weather, marriage, or meat. Men in the Winterfell camp heard that number and did not laugh. The point was not whether 40,000 would ever stand in one neat field at one neat hour. The point was that the far north had stopped being scattered enough to dismiss and had started becoming political enough to bargain. That was what the White Tree meeting was truly about. Not immediate conquest, not surrender. Terms. The far northerners wanted freer passage through the northern roads and markets. They wanted lower tolls on hides, whale oil, furs, horn, saltfish, dragonglass salvage, timber, and iron trade coming south. They wanted protected rights for caravans and coast traffic moving between their territories and the northern houses. They wanted recognized settlement corridors. Instead of being treated like tolerated smugglers, every time they crossed a stream, someone south of the line had named his border. Most dangerous of all to certain old northern lords, they wanted pathways into legitimacy, rights to hold lordship in named lands, rights to purchase or lease ground, rights to intermarry into weaker northern houses, without always being spoken of as temporary barbarians who happened to bring good trade in hard winters. The King of Winterfell heard them in a long timber hall built for the council near the old White Tree grounds, with northern lords to one side and the delegation of King Lando, the first of Hardhome, facing them across tables weighted by maps, seal boxes, and half-frozen ink. The barracking sat stern and old-fashioned, caring more for where men might settle than how much richer the toll roads could become. The harbour voices from the White Knife cared about controlled trade but mistrusted open movement. The mountain and frontier lords wanted stronger law first and easier passage later, if later ever came at all. Lando came prepared for all of them. He did not arrive in skins and noise, the way some Southron imaginations would have preferred. He arrived with road captains, ledgermen, interpreters, and stern household figures who spoke clearly about traffic rights, customs, transit guarantees, and what amounted to a frontier compact. Open the line more fairly, lower the worst tolls, recognize certain far northern polities as lawful partners rather than tolerated nuisances, and the North would gain trade, grain balance, safer movement, and fewer reasons for desperate raiding. No one in the Northern Council trusted that argument enough to embrace it. That was the problem. The proposal made practical sense in parts, and that made it more dangerous than an obvious insult would have been. Some younger lords saw profit. Some older men saw the beginning of being outnumbered in their own outer lands a generation later. Housemen tied to the harsher frontier feared that open passage would become open seepage, then marriage, then charters, then claims, then southern scribes pretending it had all happened naturally. The King of Winterfell himself did not reject the terms with bluster. He asked what law would bind the far north once free passage was granted. Lando answered, mutual law, road law, market law, and reciprocal penalties for raid, seizure, murder, or caravan theft. The answer was too intelligent for comfort. It made several men in the room feel that the old wild border they preferred to imagine was already gone. So the meeting dragged on and hardened. Rights to passage turned into arguments over rights to settle. Trade became arguments over toll sovereignty. Marriage questions became arguments over inheritance. Recognition of northern lordship beyond the old line became the most explosive subject in the whole hall. Could a hard-home king's cousin, or a frost daughter, or a Then branch one day hold recognized land south of the harsher frontier and stand in a northern court as lawful nobility, rather than tolerated outsider wealth? The answer from the gathered lords was no, not cleanly, not now, and not without terms so tight that Lando's side read them as dressed refusal. By the third day, it was obvious that no full agreement would be reached. The council had not failed in the simple sense. It had accomplished something colder. It had revealed what the next struggle would actually be about, not merely raids, but belonging. When the council broke, no swords were drawn, and no feast sealed the business. The King of Winterfell rode back from White Tree with his authority intact, and his caution sharpened. King Lando, the first of Hardhome, returned to his own people with the same thing. Pride unbent, trade still contested, and a clearer understanding that the North feared his world less for what it was now than for what it might become if allowed to root itself legally into the old houses. That was the true outcome of the White Tree meeting. The North had looked into the far north and seen not a raid party, but an emerging political neighbor demanding better terms, freer movement, and a share of legitimacy. The far north had looked back and seen that Winterfell and its circle were willing to buy, sell, and bargain, but not yet willing to admit that history at the edge of the world was changing. The reports sent south after that meeting carried the danger plainly enough for any serious ruler to hear it. The line beyond the safer north would not be decided only by battle. It would be decided by markets, roads, titles, marriages, passage rights, in which kings learn soon enough that a frontier can become a second country, while the old court is still calling it a border problem. That was what waited for High King Torren when the time came for him to take the northern question back into his own hands.